Okay, as you're viewing this, by now you should have read the Lakota creation story by Albert Whitehat. If you haven't read that, please go to the tab under content called Creation Stories and read that story before you view this narrated PowerPoint. Some of the content in this PowerPoint goes back to what we learned in the creation story. So every community that I can think of, whether native or not, has a trickster type figure. And the Lakota people are no different than any other community in that they have an entity, a spirit, who goes by the name of Iktomi. Iktomi has all different forms, but some of the forms that it takes are like really closely related to a spider. So we're going to be looking at some of the ways that Iktomi appears in not just the creation story, but in many, many stories that the Lakota people share and pass on. For some background, the Lakota are part of a larger confederacy called Oceti-Sakowin, or the Seven Council Fires. The Seven Council Fires are made up of three different sub-communities: the Dakota, the Lakota, and the Nakota. These three groups they share a language, but they have different dialects. So, for example, Lakota, in that language we use the T, Lakota, but for Nakota, they use a D, Nakoda. So the languages between these three groups varies a little bit, but they have the same origin, some of the same ceremonies, and the differences are in dialect and some of the geographical particular things that each community has. So the first of this larger group is the Dakota, and they're made up of four different communities: the Mdewakantawan, which are the Spirit Lake people and are considered the oldest people of the Confederacy; the Wapekute, the Wapetawan, and the Sisttawan. So those four communities make up what we know of as the Dakota, and they are the furthest east on the other side of the Missouri River, and they are the place of the origin where all of these different nations came from. Next, we have the Nakota, or the Nakoda, as I said. That's Ihanktonwa or Yanktone and Ihanktonwana. The people who live at Fort Belknap, the Assiniboine, are Nakoda people. They split away, or they sort of made a split from the Dakota, and many of them ended up here, obviously, in what's now Montana, and some went with Sitting Bull up to what's now Canada. And so they are known as the Stony people, but they're part of the Nakota Alliance. And then we have the Lakota. They are the Tetonwan. They are the people of the Tetons. And they have also broken down into 7 subdivisions: the Oglala, Hunkpapa, Sikanju, Minikanju, Sahashapa, Oenumpa, and Itazipako. I never say that one right. They're also known as the Sanzar people. You can find out more about those subdivisions if you click on that link there, but they are the third. So Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, all part of the Seven Council Fires, or Oceti-Sakowin. So again, by now you've read the creation story, and you know that Inyan is the first sort of power that is in the world, and Inyan makes a choice to drain itself of its blood. Inyan's blood is blue, and as it drains itself to let creation come into being, one of the first things that it creates through the powers of the thunder, the Wakiyan, is the Earth Mother. But we also know that it created at the same time, in this sort of counterbalance of power, We, which is the sun, and Hami, which is the moon. And one of the things that you should get from the creation story by Albert Whitehat is that everything comes into existence simultaneously. So when one entity is created, the opposite power arises simultaneously, which suggests to us that there's balance at the center of the Lakota cosmology, or the way they understand their place within a larger cosmos. And so the sun and the moon are no exception. They came into being simultaneously. So we also have Shka, which is the sky, and Tate, which is the wind. So these two entities or powers came into existence simultaneously. Of course, we know Iyan, when draining the blood, created this orb that became Maka, or Mother Earth. And the counterpart of Mother Earth is Unk, which are the primordial waters. Ampetu and Hanyetu are light and darkness. So again, these two powers came into being when Maka said to Iyan, it's too dark. That was already the energy, and light emerged from that knowledge, or that awareness of the darkness. Another one of the entities in the creation story is Ite. And Ite is a beautiful goddess-like figure. She's the daughter of Shkan and the wife of Tate. It's important, as we're talking about these energies, to not necessarily apply gender to them, especially to Iyan. Iyan's neither he nor she. And a lot of these very early primordial powers don't necessarily have gender assigned to them. So Ite, though, is female, and she is the daughter of Shkan and the wife of Tate. She's quite beautiful, but one of the stories about her is that she's also quite a trickster herself. So in relationship with Iktomi, she plays a trick on Hanwi, which is the moon, by taking her place next to Han, the sun. And when Hanwi enters and is going to take her place, it used to be in the Lakota cosmogony that the sun and the moon would appear together in the sky, because they were kind of mated in that way. They were together. But after Ite took that spot temporarily and sat next to Han, the story is that the moon, or Hanwi, was so embarrassed by that she hid her face from the sun. So that's the story that the Lakota peoples tell about why the sun and the moon most often appear in the sky at opposite times. But as punishment for doing this to Hanwi, Ite was given a very gnarled, scarred half of her face. So she becomes, from Ite, she becomes Anugite, which is the double-faced woman. And she's one of the most important figures in Lakota stories, because she's really the embodiment of opposite energy, opposite power, opposite being. So as you can see, one side of her face is still quite beautiful, quite alluring, quite pleasant to look at. But when she turns her head in a certain way, the other side of her face is shown, and it's known to, this picture doesn't depict it as much, but it's known to, be kind of a terrifying sight to behold. So she's the double-faced woman, or two-faced woman, and she's the one who tricked the moon in those early stories. And as I mentioned, she's in a pretty close relationship with Iktomi. Iktomi was one of the reasons that she initially led that trick against Hanwi. Iktomi was kind of whispering in her ear to do that. And Iktomi also is the one that encourages her to help him play a trick on the people that are emerging from the primordial place called Wind Cave up into the world as it is. So I'll tell you this story. It's a much more elaborate version from the oral tradition, but I'll tell you just the basics of it. So once the world was in existence, and all of the relatives, four-legged winged ones, those that swim, and the two-legged human beings had inhabited it for a good while, the people began to turn away from these kind of divine instructions and began to just not follow that way of life that was balanced and holistic and life affirming. So the more they turned away from those instructions, the more they started to cause devastation and destruction for Maka, the Earth Mother. So 2 times she got rid of human beings by shaking herself. But the third time human beings were inhabiting the earth, they were just very, very destructive. And Maka could not take it anymore. So she brought in all of her children that were still living in a good way, and that did include humans and other relatives, brought them inside herself. And so, according to Lakota traditions, it was down, down, down in the depths of the inner part of Maka that where her children resided. And then she shook herself very violently. So everything that was destructive just went spinning off of her and was lost forever. And so we can't possibly comprehend. This is a time incomprehensibly long ago. Can't understand how long it was that the people remained within Maka, but it was a long, long time until Iktomi and Anugite decided to come up with a plan. So Iktomi went to her and said, let's convince the two-leggeds to come back up to the surface, even though it wasn't ready yet. But they wanted to convince them to come up and live on the surface of the earth again. So he convinced Anugite, and she took her companion, the wolf, and she sort of provided the wolf in this pack with all of the things from the surface of the earth. So meat, dried meat, berries, things that were growing. And she sent the wolf down into this cavernous place where the wolf encountered the people that were still inside of Maka, the Earth Mother. And as they opened up the pack and began to enjoy all of the things from the earth, they started to get excited and say, let's go, let's go to the surface of the earth. But one among them, Tokahe, which translates as first person, first human, said, no, we haven't received those divine instructions to go back to the surface yet. I'm not going to go. And so most of the people stayed with Tokahe, but a few people were really tempted by what the wolf, Anugite and Iktomi, had presented to them. So they followed the wolf up to the surface. And when they got there, they came out through the entrance to the cave, and they saw that things were growing, that there was life on the earth. And they were also greeted by the beautiful side of Anugite, who welcomed them and encouraged them to enjoy all of the fruits of the earth, which they did, and they gorged themselves, and they became bigger and bigger and bigger, and pretty soon they couldn't go back into the cave. They were too large. And so that's when Anugite revealed that other side of her face, and they realized that they had been tricked by tricksters, and that now they were going to stay on the surface of the earth forever. And they became the buffalo. The Lakota are known as the Buffalo Nation, and that's because they made these first emerging beings made an agreement with Tokahe and the people below that when it was time for them to come to the surface of the earth, the buffalo would be of service to them, would provide them with what they needed in terms of clothing, in terms of food, in terms of shelter. So it's this very, very early story of the connection between the buffalo and the people. And so that goes back to the creation story. And obviously, tricksters in native cultures can be very devious, but they can also be teachers and guides that show the way for the people to go, and sometimes in a contrary way to what the tricksters themselves do. So James R. Walker, Albert Whitehat mentions him in that creation story that you've read by now. He was a physician who worked at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation from 1896 to 1914. And during that time he was there, he became very close with the medicine men, the elders and the medicine men who were still living there. And he recorded and transcribed the stories of these medicine men. And some of the stories were Iktomi stories or trickster stories. And this is one from a medicine man called Old Horse. And I'll just give you a minute to read this. This is in Walker's book on page 128. So as Albert Whitehat and others mentioned, Iktomi can take many different forms. Most often we see him as related to a spider, and that's why Lakota peoples tend to not kill spiders, even when they're in the house, because it would be like killing or doing harm to the trickster. But if you do end up having to kill a spider or accidentally kill a spider, you should say Tunkashi le Wakiyanke, which means grandfather. That wasn't me who did that. That was the thunder beings who killed the spider. Anyway, that's one of those Lakota stories. But this second to last line, Iktomi, is Heyoka. The best translation for Heyoka is a contrary or a backwards person. And a Heyoka doesn't choose to be a Heyoka. That burden is placed on them by whatever means. There are some Lakota stories where people just, sitting in their lodge during a storm and lightning comes in and strikes them, and they become Heyoka or contrary people. So in that case, they do everything the opposite of everybody else. So even as simple as in ceremony, when you enter into a sweat lodge, you're supposed to go to the left around the circle and seat yourself that way if you're one gender. You're supposed to go the other way if you're the other gender. Well, a Heyoka will do whatever the opposite, whatever the norm is, they do the opposite. Same thing in the sun dance when the dancers come out and go around dancing and facing the sun. The Heyoka will go the opposite direction. And finally, as I told those people in the classroom today, during Sundance, the dancers go without food or water as they make this sacrifice on behalf of the people for 4 days and 4 nights. So, as a supporter, somebody who's there to support the dancers, it's really frowned upon for you to show up down near them with a water bottle or even a cup of something to drink, because they are making that ultimate sacrifice. So you keep water out of their vision. But I've seen Heyoka come into the arbor dancing with a bucket of water and a ladle and just drink from it right in front of the dancers and pour water all over themselves, because again, their job as a Heyoka is to do the opposite. And again, it's a burden to be Heyoka. Some people say Crazy Horse, who we'll be talking about in the next few weeks, was also a Heyoka. But Iktomi certainly one of the most significant of Heyokas. There's another story, Iktomi and the Buffalo Skull, and there are different communities that have different versions of this, but it goes into the whole shape-shifting skill that Iktomi has. Basically, the story is he's wandering around on the prairie one day, and all of a sudden he hears these drums, and he hears music and dancing, but he's looking all around and he can't figure out what it is that's going on until he looks down and there's a buffalo skull. And as he peers inside the buffalo skull, he sees that there are these little bugs inside that are doing a ceremony, just like humans do, right? Drumming, dancers, singing, and he gets really curious. So he is able to shapeshift. He makes himself really small, and he crawls into the buffalo skull to see what's going on, and he observes for a while. But before he exits the buffalo skull, he returns back to the original size he was. And because he grows so quickly, the buffalo skull gets lodged onto his head. So as you can imagine, being a Heyoka and doing things contrarily, he just starts running like the crazy person, right? He's running everywhere. He's bumping into trees. He's falling down or whatever, and he's trying to find his way back to his community. So one of the things Iktomi is known for is wandering away from his community, out on his own, and then always finding his way back. But as he's coming back into his own village, the warriors there see this really weird sight, right? It's Iktomi's body with a buffalo skull, and it's running crazy, and it's bumping into things, and so immediately they think this is a danger. So they start chasing him and chasing him, and eventually he has to jump into a river to get away from them, and the river carries him right down to his own lodge, where his wife is sitting there waiting for him. And again, another thing about Iktomi, he's a wanderer in all ways. He's a known womanizer, and so his wife is perpetually jealously chasing after him, right? So here he lands on the shore, and she takes this mallet and just smashes his head and smashes the buffalo skull, and there's Iktomi having to say to his woman, thank you and I'm sorry. So that's just one of the other Iktomi stories that we'll be talking about. But that's the first sort of entity that's sort of tied to the creation story that you've read now by Albert Whitehead, and more to come with Lakota Star Knowledge.